Welcome back to another episode of Diplomatic Discord. I'm your host Khalil Al-Wazir, joining you as a PhD student in international relations at the University of Toronto. And if this is your first time tuning in with us, then you should know that the focus of this program, of this podcast, is to bridge the information asymmetries between the world of academia and the world of diplomacy. This is because we find ourselves in an age where scholars and practitioners often work in isolation. They're siloed within their own fields. And this is a problem because it creates gaps, voids filled with misunderstandings and missed opportunities for collaboration. And the purpose of this podcast is to create a space for these worlds to meet and interact, to bridge the gaps and the information asymmetries between them. Our goal is to serve as a conduit, a bridge, if you will, that allows ideas to flow freely between these two crucial sectors. After all, when the world of thought meets the world of action, extraordinary things can happen. And today, in particular, we turn our attention to an international relations theory of enduring relevance, the theory of classical realism, and in particular, one man's work within this corpus. And to some, the term classical realism may seem like a relic of the past, perhaps even an abstract concept relegated to dusty library shelves. Yet, its tenets, its wisdom, and yes, even its criticisms offer a wealth of insights for those in the diplomatic arena today. And you might wonder, why classical realism? Why now? Well, let me tell you, this particular branch of theory has its roots that have influenced many political thinkers and decision makers for generations. It's considered one of the principal pillars of political theory in international relations. And it's a lens through which we can better understand power dynamics, human nature, and the often turbulent seas of international politics. Yet, before we start, it's important to address some of the criticism leveled against theory. We often hear that these theories are often too far removed from the day-to-day affairs of state. They argue, these critics, that such theories paint with broad brushstrokes, glossing over the cultural and historical nuances that make each interaction on the international stage unique. They point to the predictive limitations of these theories, that despite lofty claims, theories can and do fail to foresee the actions of states, and sometimes with disastrous consequences. But perhaps the most disheartening criticism that usually comes from diplomats themselves against these theories is that they are too mechanical, too rigid to capture the living, breathing dynamics of human interaction on the international stage, that they reduce the art of diplomacy to a set of formulas. And these critics, they justifiably argue that international relations at its core is a human endeavor, sculpted by the unpredictable facets of human emotion, rationale, and instinct, qualities that no theory can wholly capture, and some would even say that this is more a task for the study of psychology. Yet, we must also recognize the indispensable role of theory. We advocate for it because in a complex world where nation states engage in a high-stakes game of power and principle, when you're navigating this world without a theoretical lens, the interactions of these states can seem like mere chaos, impossible to understand or predict. And whether we like to admit it or not, whether these policies makers like to admit or not, they operate also on some set of principles and assumptions that guide their decisions. They just don't bring it out for scrutiny. And when these principles are flawed, the consequences are grave, leading to failed policies, missed opportunities, and strategic blunders. So good theory brings out those often hidden principles and assumptions from the shadows of the unconscious mind and subjects these assumptions to empirical scrutiny. Like the classical realism we discussed today, theory helps to structure our thinking, allowing policymakers to better understand the motivations and likely moves of other nations. So, to say it differently, theories offer a map of reality. Their purpose is to help us navigate this reality. Their utility derives from its ability to provide a framework for sound decision making. And for a map to be useful, it has to omit certain variables. A one-to-one map of reality is useless, for when you clutter a map with too much information, you can't really navigate the world. And to put it in perspective, a one-to-one map of Boston would quite literally be the size of Boston. An accurate subway map would include every slight curve, every building, every street name along the railway track. But because map makers know that too much information would confuse the traveler, they draw representations of colorful straight lines representing general travel directions and big stops so that you can find your way. So too do theory builders in international relations try to omit certain variables to construct a model of a complex diplomatic environment. Yet we also have to be aware that too much simplicity can also lead to serious mistakes, and that the gravest errors are committed when one mistakes theory for reality, the map for the territory. And I won't deny that many IR theories have sacrificed too much reality, omitted too many relevant variables in the search for theoretical parsimony and coherence, limiting the usefulness of theory for the world of practical diplomacy. But I'm glad to say that the theory we will explore today is of practical relevance. Its assumptions and principles have not sacrificed reality for the altar of theoretical parsimony. Quite the opposite. Its precepts were driven by reality, shaped by the challenges of the time, and is a theory that has informed the thinking and decision-making of consequential policymakers. And although classical realist thought is relatively new, the tradition of realism in political thought is ancient. The principles guiding its premises have withstood the test of time, even if they often grate our moral sensibilities. Classical realism finds its antecedents in the writings of ancient thinkers like Thucydides, who charted the dynamics driving the near-inevitable conflicts that arise when powers rise and fall. It draws from the cold calculus of Machiavelli, who peeled back the veneer of political idealism to reveal the self-interested mechanisms underneath. And it's echoed in the play of Realpolitik and the international agreements of a European history that has grappled with the challenges of maintaining order and equilibrium in a multipolar environment. And this is the theory of Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau, one of the founders of realist thought. So, having navigated through the undercurrents of this thought, both ancient and modern, we are now trying to dissect Morgenthau's theory. And he authored one of the seminal books called Politics Among Nations. And let's be clear, this book was no mere academic exercise. It was a response to the urgent questions of its time, a guide born from the immediate challenges following World War II. And when Morgenthau wrote about power, he wasn't sketching abstract theories divorced from the ground realities. He was offering a usable framework. It was as if he looked at the world, saw it for the tangled web it was, and offered a lens to make sense of it, one that didn't blur the intricacies or oversimplify the complex. And this is why Morgenthau and his work resonate so well with the mission of our podcast. And for those in the corridors of diplomatic decision-making, the lessons gleaned from Politics Among Nations are far from arcane theories. They are practical tools oriented by a certain set of principles, 6 principles in particular. These are the principles of political realism. And first, Morgenthau brings us face to face with a fundamental truth. The causes of conflict in international relations are astonishingly similar to the tensions we find in our own interpersonal relationships. And these are not guided by some obscure theoretical construct, but by innate human drives that shape our very existence. These drives, the drives of human nature, they range from fear to self-interest, from pride to insecurity, and from greed to a will to power. It's these primal motivations that are often invisible architects of the international conflict we see around us, and just as much as they are also the cause of conflicts in our daily lives. And the second principle, if we were to simplify the complex game of international relations to one element, it's the principle of power. And power isn't just another variable. It is the yardstick by which all things are measured in politics. It's the currency that states accumulate, spend, and save, and sometimes they even squander. And in the end, it's the power that decides which nations come out ahead and which fall behind. It's the measure and the method, the question and the answer of politics. And the third principle, Morgenthau recognizes that while power is the primary currency, its value can change based on cultural context. And it's tempting to see this as a contradictory point to some of his other points that we'll discuss later. But to put it in perspective, let's consider an example. The power of a strong military might be an asset in a region where hard power dominates, but less influential in areas where economic or soft power takes precedence. Military might carries more weight in geopolitically unstable regions, while economic influence reigns supreme in global financial hubs. So Morgenthau reminds us that the exchange rate of power, as they say, isn't fixed. It fluctuates based on the particular dynamics of a given setting. And the fourth principle, Morgenthau never dismisses the moral weight of political actions. He is acutely aware of the tensions that often exist between the dictates of morality and the imperatives of effective statecraft. Realism doesn't suggest that leaders abandon morality. Instead, it advises them to apply moral principles judiciously, cognizant of the context in which they operate. And this nuance is critical for anyone involved in the business of statecraft. It's the tension between what's right and what's effective that often defines the gray area diplomats must navigate. And the fifth principle is that Morgenthau strongly cautions against a perilous pitfall, the conflation of national objectives with universal moral principles. And the Americans are most to fall prey to this. He warns that mistaking one's own moral code or national interests as universally applicable can lead to catastrophic errors in judgment. Think of Iraq's invasion. Such a worldview risks not just the welfare of one's own nation, but the delicate balance of international relations. And sixth, and finally, as we discussed, the political realist maintains a laser-like focus on the political sphere's autonomy. In the theater of international relations, the spotlight always falls on how policy impacts the nation's power and interests. This approach, rooted in a realistic view of human nature, enables the political realist to discern where the nation's actual interests diverge from more legalistic or idealistic perspectives. So to put it simply, Hans Morgenthau's principles offer today's policymakers a robust yet nuanced lens through which to view the intricate and often unpredictable world of politics. But more important than these guiding principles are those tangible theoretical contributions that he provides. So let's move on to a discussion of the toolkits he provides for practitioners and interested students of international politics alike. And in this light, let's begin with his theory. And one of the contributions that he has provided to the field of politics, and he's simplified much of the goals and objectives of politics to three basic patterns. These are the recognition that states will either try to increase power, to keep their power, or to demonstrate their power. Think about it this way, that these are the three possible patterns of politics, and they often lead to also three different policies within international relations. If you are wishing to keep your power, you might be more willing to accept the status quo. You'll adopt a policy of the status quo, which is what he calls it. But if you are looking to increase your power, you're unhappy with the current distribution of power in the balance of power in the international arena, then you might wish to seek an imperialistic policy where you try to change and gain more power for your country. And the last point is you might wish to just demonstrate power. Think of a country that's reached its peak and now is starting to feel the pressures from a rising power. It might wish to demonstrate its power through one conflict or another so that it sends a message to everybody around it that it's still a relevant player. And it keeps some of its own unstable but committed alliances in check so that none of them defect. And when it comes to understanding international politics, it's not only important to understand that there are three ways of navigating a nation's policy, But it's also important to know what contributes to a nation's power. What are the determinants of national power? And Morgenthau outlines quite a few. The first is geography. The geographic features of a particular nation can really determine whether it feels secure or insecure, whether it has a defensive or an offensive necessity. And it can also determine how many resources there are in the country, what type of resources there are, whether it can help them become relevant on the global stage through these resources, or whether they are self-sufficient or dependent on another nation for their supplies. So geography really matters as one of the determinants of national power, and as well natural resources. Now the second thing, or the third thing, is industrial capacity. And this matters because the more you can produce, the more advanced your machinery and your technology, the more productive your nation is, the higher its growth and economy is, the larger its economy is, and therefore the more you can fund military efforts and endeavors. Because the link between the economy and the military is bidirectional. If you have a strong economy, that means you can build a stronger military. And the fourth thing is military preparedness. How well equipped the army is, how well trained the army is, how well integrated the army is. These are essential features and factors that lead to a nation's power. Overestimating or underestimating one's military preparedness can be disastrous, and it's often one of the major reasons nations fail to win wars. We can see this, for example, in the context of today's war with Ukraine and Russia, where Russia entered that battle with high expectations of its own military preparedness, only to be struck by reality, to recognize that they were nowhere near as prepared as they thought they were. So military preparedness, natural resources, and geography determine a nation's power. But there are other factors too that matter. The level and size of your population, and the various skills and human capital that is present in that population, whether they're well-educated or low-skilled labor, whether you have technicians, engineers, scientists working on the frontiers of technological progress and scientific advancement. This translates very quickly into military advantages. And if you think about the most powerful military today, that of the United States, it's also the most advanced technologically. And it also tends to be the largest economy in the world. So all of those go hand in hand together, and they are major determinants of a nation's power. And the interesting part about Morgenthau's determinants of national power, one thing that separates him from other realists, particularly the neo-realist theorists of today, is that he also examines the national character and the national morale as determinants of power. And think about the values and norms that ingrain that society, how cohesive they are, and how unified people are, can really determine a nation's strength. And similarly, the national morale of that country, which he defines as the willingness of the people and the acceptance of the people of the foreign policy of its leaders. This is also a crucial determinant of national power. And there's no better demonstration of this than the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War cannot be understood without reference to the domestic considerations that happened in the United States. The loss of national morale for that conflict, the loss of public support for the policies of its leaders, the foreign policy of the Vietnam War, led to the loss of that war, the withdrawal of the United States. So the national character is also a determinant of power as well as its morale. And the final factor that determines a nation's power, perhaps the most important and the most unstable, is the quality of the diplomats in that country. If you think about it, having quality diplomats, statesmen, and policymakers can make the difference between wasted advantages and seized opportunities. Having a quality set of talent in the civil service, in the foreign service, can determine whether that country can fully integrate and leverage all of the might of that nation's power, all of the various factors together towards a particular ends, towards the service of the national interest. And unfortunately, this is also the most unstable of determinants of national power, because you never know when the next round of leaders comes, if they're going to be good or if they're going to be ineffective. So that concludes the determinants of national power. And before we move on, I'd like to add another caveat that's quite important. The quality of the diplomats cannot be understated. It's so crucial because if you think about it, having good diplomats in peacetime is equivalent of having good generals in wartime. If you don't have good diplomats in wartime, you lose the war and lose the nation. But if you don't have good generals in wartime, you lose the war and lose the nation. But if you don't have good diplomats in peacetime, you fail to seize opportunities, to pursue the national interest, to avert wars when they shouldn't happen, but can happen, and to increase a nation's economic potential. Because trade agreements are a huge factor in diplomacy. So these are the factors that determine national power. And whenever a diplomat or any state wishes to assess its position in the global stage and ascertain its strategies for moving forward, whether to keep power, whether to increase power, and whether to demonstrate power, these nations have to do so while also calculating the national power of its neighbors, of the great powers, and of other states. And there are certain problems that often lead to miscalculations and errors in judgment whenever one is evaluating national power. And this is one of the most common mistakes. It's the absolute character of power, which is the problem of ignoring relativity, of assuming that a nation's power is absolute, that it's constant. When in international politics, power is always relative. If one nation has more power than you, then you, by definition, have less power. Whether or not your absolute power has stayed the same or decreased. It didn't decrease, but because that other nation has a higher amount than you, then you are at a disadvantage. So power is not permanent, and it changes. And even the nature or the character of power can change as well. A technological innovation today could fundamentally change the balance of power among nations, and it can transform relationships. I mean, think about the recent but the innovation by China to have developed hypersonic missiles. This was what the United States considered its Sputnik moment. They realized that they didn't have any defensive capacities that can fend against these super advanced missiles. And it led to a race for new technological innovations. At any moment in time and in history, such an innovation can happen that can upend the global balance. Think of AI today. Whoever masters this could be at the frontier of not only technology, but of military potential. And the third problem with estimating a nation's national power is the fallacy of the single factor, putting too much emphasis on one of the various determinants of power, saying that, I have a population of 2 billion, therefore I am strong, and focusing too much on that, or focusing maybe too much on a nation's quality of diplomats or on a nation's industrial potential. Overemphasizing one factor can lead to a certain problem in analysis. And to put it in perspective, let's put it at one of the old theories. There was once a man called Halford Mackinder. He wrote a book called The Geographical Pivot of History. And for Mackinder, he used to say that geography is what determines pretty much everything, what determines national power. When in reality, it's many of the factors that we've mentioned, from technology to industrial capacity to economic growth and the people's potential and human capital, and all of these factors, they matter. Depending on geography alone will not ensure your security. And seeing it as the be-all and end-all of politics is a grave mistake and error that diplomats and statesmen are wise to avoid. And this brings us to another important consideration, another important theoretical contribution by Hans Morgenthau. And this is the concept of the balance of power. Now, to be fair, he wasn't the one who invented it. The balance of power has been a principle of diplomacy and international politics from, as far as I can remember, the Spanish Wars of Succession, the 30 Years' War, to even the post-Napoleonic Wars and the World Wars as well, except the second one. The balance of power is crucial for maintaining stability. And the balance of power emerges naturally from the competition between states and powers. And it often happens whenever one state is trying to overcome or maintain a current status quo. As nations compete among themselves, they quickly identify the real limits of their strength and potential. And they also recognize better the powers of their opponents. So this helps maintain a certain balance, a certain equilibrium that is often a stabilizing factor in international relations. And Morgenthau argues that there are a few basic patterns to the balance of power. There is a few scenarios that often occur. There is often direct competition between one, two, or more states where they're quite literally competing among each other. And in that competition, they find the limits of their power and identify an equilibrium and balance between them. But there's also another pattern, which is indirect competition, either over a third country or a certain territory, that often happens as nations pursue their policies. And in this, the same principles occur. Over that competition, they find out the measure of their limits. And there are a few functions to the balance of power. It serves as a balancer. It maintains a precarious stability. And it always aims at a certain risk that needs to be established. And for many, the balance of power is a guarantee of security. Security from other nations, from occupiers. And we see this in particular for small countries. Small countries in particular often owe their existence to a balance of power. No small country, especially in geographically strategic regions, can maintain its autonomy and independence without a balance of power that permits its autonomy and independence. I mean, think about countries like Singapore. I remember Lee Kuan Yew even stating this explicitly, that it would not survive if there were not a balance of power that permits its existence. And this is one of the reasons why Singapore is, for example, very hesitant to pick one side or another in the current competition between China and the United States. And think of Belgium as well, and other Balkan countries until World War II. These countries existed solely because of the balance of power in the region, or because they served as a buffer between states that are competing in that balance of power. And these buffer states also only permit their existence. Their existence is only permitted if there is a balance of power that permits its existence. So how do you maintain a balance of power in international relations? There are a few strategies. There's one, the strategy of divide and rule. And this is the strategy that aims to keep competitors weak through division or by strengthening weaker nations. For a long time in Europe, for example, Germany was divided into many principalities. And it was divided as such because there was a strong France and a strong Russia. And historically, whenever there was a strong France and a strong Russia, there was a divided Germany. It couldn't be otherwise, because that's how the balance was maintained. Today, on the other hand, because of NATO and the American security umbrella, it's a different story. And there's another theorist that we'll discuss in another episode called Walt. Waltz managed to create a theory of a structural international relations theory which examines the dynamics that lead to two patterns, balancing and bandwagoning. I mean, if you think about it, let's say you're a country that maintains its existence because there's a balance of power. Let's say you're England. England is a great example for this historically, because England has for a long time been a balancer in European affairs. It was secure by its geography. Any power from the continent had to cross the channels to occupy England, so they felt more secure in this way. But the English recognized that their independence, their autonomy, could very easily be jeopardized if there was one power who dominated the whole continent of Europe. And that's why England has, for a long time, been the balancer of European affairs, of European competition. And they would often do so by siding with the weaker side in a particular conflict so that they can balance the scales between them and maintain a certain stability. And they always sought to maintain that balance for their survival. Think of Napoleon, for example. They sided with Russia against Napoleon because he was too powerful. He was intent on the conquest of all of Europe, which would have threatened England eventually. And another way of maintaining a balance is through compensations and agreements. And often these are very unfair for certain countries that are in the middle between them. These compensations often happen by different great powers or regional powers, powerful players, dividing among themselves the territories of particular nations. Think of Poland and the three partitions of Poland in 1772, 1793, and 1795. And historically, they used the fertility of the soil and population as a standard for determining the compensations, how they would divide a particular territory among themselves. These days, you don't see it as much, but it used to be a common feature of international politics then. The third way of maintaining a balance of power is by maintaining parity in armaments and weaponry, and perhaps even technology as well, which often leads to arms races among regions. Whenever there's an equilibrium and one state decides to secure newer or more potent weapons or more weapons, then everybody around it also feels a need to increase their own armaments so that they can maintain the balance. And this is how arms races begin. And the fourth way of maintaining a balance of power is through alliances. And this is so common in European history. For example, think of the alliances that occurred in Europe against Napoleon and against Hitler. These alliances are formed to counteract an imperialistic policy usually, or to maintain a parity between multiple states. They're protection pacts and guarantees that if one nation is under conflict or attacked, that the other would come to its aid. So we've discussed the various ways of maintaining a balance of power, the importance of a balance of power, particularly for some nations who depend on that balance of power for their existence. And we've also discussed the role of balancers, those who are considered the holders of the balance, like England. These are countries who, due to certain geographic opportunities, can play a role where they can support the weaker side in any unbalanced situation so that they can maintain parity and maintain equilibrium. And one of the characteristics of these balancers is something that the Brits used to call splendid isolation, that it stays detached to assess which scale needs more support, which side of the balance is of greater need. And there's a huge set of advantages that accrue to those nations that are considered holders of the balance, balancers, if you will. And it's that it plays a key role, a very powerful position in the international system. They're often arbiters between states and conflicts. They can be mediators. They can set conditions for joining alliances that support their own national interests. And it can also use that position to achieve more of its national interests and objectives. So the balancers have certain key advantages. And it's an important position for many states. To be fair, the United States was at some point a balancer. Today it's a hegemon. We're moving to a more multipolar world now, but it used to be also a balancer to some extent in European affairs. When it came to aid the Allied defense against the Nazi invasions of Europe, the US was there acting as a certain balancer too. But because it's the most powerful country in the world today, and even back then it was even more so powerful, it was quite literally 50% of the world's economy, one nation. Then it became essentially a hegemon that can maintain a certain semblance of order. It completely upended the balance of power in Europe, and it became the guarantor of peace and security for most of those nations there. So there are quite a few challenges to determining and maintaining a balance of power. And one of those challenges is in properly assessing and qualifying a nation's strength. So we've already mentioned the determinants, but when it comes to such a complex assessment of various factors together, how do you identify the true measure of a nation's strength? Is it this unit of geography with this unit of industrial capacity and this unit of military preparedness? How do you figure out the different proportions and measure the balance of power? Because it's so difficult to identify these factors, often mistakes and miscalculations occur. And these miscalculations often end in conflict. Conflict which really sets the scene and sets the limits of expectations. It reduces the information gaps and asymmetries between the two powers and lets them know the true measure of their national power. And it's often through conflict that you attain a certain balance, but through miscalculation that you lead to conflict. So the absence of any quantifiable metric for the nation's power is one of the determinants of it. And the fact that so many complex factors are involved, think of technology which can change at a dime's moment notice, these are really important features and factors. And another thing is often when determining this balance of power, nations, because they know it's so uncertain, they often seek a certain margin of safety. And that margin of safety can also inadvertently increase insecurity. And this is a concept called the security dilemma. It's not mentioned by Morgenthau, but the security dilemma is the notion that when you seek to increase your own security, you inadvertently increase another's insecurity. And this is one of the key causes of arms races and war in history. So it's one of the dangers is in seeking to provide a certain margin of safety because of the uncertainty involved. You may actually increase insecurity. And another problem when it comes to ascertaining the balance of power is that sometimes, and this is particularly true if there are certain technological advances that change the calculus of when to go to war, sometimes a change in these could shift the incentives for offense versus defense. It could, for example, incentivize a preventive war, to launch a war before it happens and seize on an opportunity because you know there's a first strike advantage, for example. And this is one of the key dilemmas in nuclear war and assessments, is the second strike versus first strike capability. Imagine you have or better yet, let's use the example of World War I, where it was the first industrial war in human history, where many of the armies and alliances were determined by the mobilization schedules of real time. And they knew that the first mover in that advantage, the first to mobilize and start a war, would have a decisive advantage. So everybody felt like they needed to mobilize, and it in a certain sense created an unstoppable momentum toward war. So it's important to recognize the dangers of certain advances in technology, or maybe even of changes in incentives for war as a strategy that could lead to more of an incentive to take on a preventive war. And historically also, sometimes nations may lie about their intentions. They may say that they want to intervene in a certain way or increase their power in a certain way because they want to maintain a balance of power. And they may do so disingenuously. It may so happen that it is the justification, the ideological justification for a nation's imperialist policy. So it's important to recognize this. And it's important now to know that there's, especially in the most internationalized and globalized world in human history, that there are some challenges to determining the balance of power, particularly when there are different hierarchies and balances of power to begin with. There are different systems and subsidiary systems and international systems that operate in the balance of power. For example, the balance of power in the Middle East is intricately tied to the balance of power on a global stage between the United States and China and India and the rest. The balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region is also tied to other regions as well. Think about, for example, here's the best way to illustrate it. The United States today is slowly withdrawing from the Middle East to become an offshore balancer. They're trying to play the role of the balancer in the region because they wanted to direct most of their attention to the competition with China in the Asia-Pacific region. But because they did so, it left an opportunity for China to go into the Middle East, which has its own balance in particular. And recently this led to a mediation effort between China, the Iranians, and Saudi Arabia, and it led to a normalization of relations between the two. And this is something that wouldn't have happened, I believe, if it weren't for the fact that the United States decided to reduce its presence in the region and become somewhat of an offshore balancer. And this is why the Arab states started normalizing with Israel, because it's the US that's trying to make it so that they ally themselves in a certain way to counterbalance Iran in the region. So there are different types of balances of power and different systems that are interconnected to each other, which makes calculations, particularly today, difficult. And because of this, we're starting to see today a declining influence for local systems of balance of power. Today, more than in perhaps any time before, perhaps not maybe the Cold War, a local balance of power will inevitably be tied to the global balance of power. I mean, think about the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Every conflict, whether in Africa, in the Middle East, had something to do with the US or with the Soviet Union. And today, in the multipolar world that we're in, it's also the case that almost every conflict today will involve, to some extent, the interests of the great powers. So, with this in mind, let's go to the definition of certain concepts and policies. In particular, the concept of the status quo. And this is a term that often comes from the term status quo antebellum, which refers to peace treaties clauses that restore pre-war sovereignty. And that the status quo aims to maintain a certain distribution of power at a particular historical moment. And it draws a parallel between the policy of the status quo in international politics and within a particular region. So the status quo policy is the policy of maintaining a certain balance. But there's also an imperialist policy, which is the policy of trying to overcome that balance. And there are different types of imperialisms in this sense. And there are different inducements towards imperialisms. There's, for example, the goal of global domination, which was the case for Napoleon, for example. It used to be the case for Alexander the Great. It used to be the case for quite a few. Hitler had a certain view for global domination. Or it could be of a certain hegemonic position in a particular region. And the reason why a state may take an imperialistic policy may also be due to a few changes in the balance of power as it exists, particularly when a defeated enemy of particular importance uh, collapses, which gives a certain opportunity for a nation to become a hegemonic and imperialistic one. And it's also enticing for certain nations. It used to be the case in World War I, for example. European empires, generally, when they carved out Africa, they did so because there were many geographic expanses with populations that don't have advanced weaponry and technology. So it was enticing for them to take on an imperialistic policy and conquer many parts of the globe and the global south. And the ways in which a nation may pursue an imperialistic policy can be manifold. They could do so through conflict, which is historically perhaps the most common way. They could do so through economic inducements, economic leverage and influence. And they could also do so through cultural influence. So there are many ways of imperialism. But the problem is it upsets the balance of power and it leads to a lot of conflict. And no nation can really truly feel secure when there's someone, say, seeking global hegemony. Because you never know what will happen. You'll be at the mercy of that nation when that happens. That's why many nations prefer to maintain a balance of power, because it maintains and guarantees their security. And better to depend on an impersonal force, like the equilibrium of the balance of power, than to risk everything in the hopes that the new hegemon or the new imperial power that dominates you will treat you as a citizen, not a subject, or as a generally allow you to live. So it's important historically to counter imperialist policies. And there are a few errors that occur historically when it comes to an imperialist policy. Because, well, it's hard to determine when a nation is taking an imperialist policy. They may say that they're pursuing a certain peaceful course of action, that they are only seeking to maintain a balance of power, that they are pursuing a certain universal ideal or norm in their conquests or their policies. But at the core of it, they're really lying. And they're actually seeking domination, hegemony, and conquest. And in these cases, it's important to really determine whether a nation is actually seeking a policy of the status quo or a policy of imperialism. And often its actions can show you its true intentions. Its territorial ambitions determine its policy. And there's a serious error that occurs when dealing with imperialist policies. And it's been done before in history, in Europe, in World War II in particular. And the gravest error you can make to an imperialistic policy is to appease the imperialist policy, to treat it as though it is seeking a policy of the status quo when in reality it's wishing to dominate and disturb the balance. Appeasement in these cases always leads to disaster. It's a misapplication of means to ends. It's the wrong strategy to that particular situation. So there are a few problems to determining whether a policy is imperialistic or not. And that's the fact that, yes, even sometimes a nation may actually be pursuing a policy of the status quo, but it could change over time. And sometimes that change could be incremental, you never know. Policies can change from seeking adjustments to the imperialistic. And it's also difficult sometimes to determine if the use of economic leverage and tools, for example, is a form of imperialistic policy or not, whether it's actually intended for like a positive sum cooperation or if it has an ulterior motive in play. And it's also difficult to determining the scale of an imperialist policy, whether it's localized or international. It's, as we mentioned, difficult to determine the ideological guises behind them. So, to conclude, I want to thank you all for joining us on this podcast, on this exploration of the dynamics that shape international politics, on this journey through the literature of Hans Morgenthau and the theoretical contributions that he has provided. So, to sum it all up, at the core of this discussion, we examine the three basic patterns that influence all political actions: the pursuit to keep, increase, or to demonstrate power. And translating this to the international sphere, we also found that nations essentially adopt policies that either aim to maintain the status quo, expand power through imperialism, or demonstrate their might through acts of prestige. Demonstrate their power to maintain loyalties of certain powers within its orbit. And these pursuits are impacted by multiple determinants of national power. Among these are geographical location, natural resources, industrial capacity, military readiness, population, the national character, and the national morale, as well as the quality of diplomats. Diplomacy serves as the linchpin that weaves all these determinants into a coherent strategy. So just like military strategy plays a critical role in times of war, diplomacy is the art that maximizes national power in peaceful times. However, in the realm of international relations, errors often occur when nations misunderstand or misinterpret the nature of power. This could be through assuming power as an absolute rather than relative, mistaking it as a permanent factor instead of a dynamic one, or attributing power to a single determinant while neglecting all others. And in the global theater, the balance of power is like a complex, multi-layered chess game. This balance is maintained through various methods, such as divide and rule strategies, compensations, armaments, and alliances. Within this intricate matrix, certain countries act as the balancers, or the arbiters, the holders of the balance, making crucial shifts to maintain the stability of the system. However, the balance of power isn't a perfect system. It has its flaws and weaknesses. There can be miscalculations, and it often requires a constant state of conflict to measure each nation's power. And while small nations and buffer states often find their existence at the mercy of these great powers, larger nations often engage in indirect or direct competition to tilt the balance in their favor. And over the years, the balance of power has shifted from European centrality to a more global stage, making it a multipolar world with significant players like the US, the European Union, China, India, and Japan, among others. And as we live in an ever-changing world, it's crucial to be aware of the different types of imperialism, be it military, economic, or cultural, and the errors nations make in countering it, such as policies of appeasement, which has historically proven to be disastrous as a strategy. So, Morgenthau provides insights to all of these features and factors, and he provided a theoretical lens to look at this. And I hope that this discussion has given you valuable insights into understanding how and why nations act the way they do on the international stage. That the realm of geopolitics is fraught with complexities is undeniable, but understanding its underlying patterns and principles can go a long way in helping us navigate this turbulent world. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode. We'll probably explore another neo-realist theorist, Waltz, which provided a more structural explanation of global politics. So thank you for listening. And if you're interested in these, be sure to follow our pages, whether you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or elsewhere. Follow us on all social media, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.